Drive to Survive Season 4, Episode 2, Ace in the Hole. This is all about McLaren, ladies and gentlemen. Danny Ricciardo in particular, the battle between him and Lando Norris. And there's a bit of Ferrari. We can sprinkle a little bit of Ferrari in there as well, because Carlos Sainz, of course, left McLaren to join Ferrari. But the narrative seems to be about Danny Ricciardo joining McLaren because the car is good, but Danny Ricciardo is not quite working with it. They make the point that this year is a huge year for McLaren, and even Zach Brown in the early doors mentions that the difference between third and fourth place in the constructors is tens of millions. So there is your story, Netflix. You can go ahead and run with this. It's a Ferrari versus McLaren situation, but in this episode in particular, we are looking at Danny Ricciardo and Lando Norris. Remember last season when they tried to give us beef between Lando Norris and Carlos Sainz? It did not work. But I tell you what, they've opened up a few peels of the onion, if you will, regarding this battle between Lando Norris and Danny Ricciardo. You get the situation in Bahrain where Danny Ricciardo actually qualifies ahead of Lando Norris, but in the race, Lando Norris gets the better of him. And then in Imola, Danny is so slow, so poor, that Lando Norris asks actually to pass him, and they let him by it, and it was just absolutely terrible. And then in Monaco, they go back to Danny Ricciardo's last ever win in Formula 1 in that Red Bull at the Monaco Grand Prix in 2018. And not only was it that terrible, but also Lando Norris laps Danny Ricciardo. Lando Norris then also ends in P3 on the podium as well, ladies and gentlemen. It's unbelievable stuff. And in the midst of all of this, Lando Norris announces his brand new contract with McLaren. It's a multi-year contract, as they say. Not quite sure the figures or the numbers per se. Everyone's a little bit hush-hush. It's quite interesting. And this idea that Lando Norris is kind of like a mean character because he sort of mentions in the press that, you know, I'm not here to feel sorry for Danny Ricciardo. And obviously it was kind of like tongue-in-cheek, but at the same time, it's very, very true. Nobody has sympathy for any other driver in Formula 1. Of course, don't be silly. But it's almost like, you know, are we trying to create more beef between the two? Not quite. In years past, if you've seen the earlier seasons of Drive to Survive, you see that Danny Ricciardo usually is frustrated with the car. At Red Bull, for example, it seemed like they favoured Max Verstappen in the Red Bull. At Renault, he was absolutely dominating, but the car was absolutely terrible. And I think for the first time in the McLaren, good car, he's actually met a good driver in Lando Norris. Norris, by the way, improving year in, year out, and it's no wonder Danny Ricciardo is getting frustrated. And this time, for the first time probably, he's looking within himself. Am I good enough? Am I good enough to be here in Formula 1? This is his 10th year in Formula 1. He's got 7 race wins, but you do feel like, you know, this is a man who's not really reached his potential. And it kind of shows here in this episode. You get to see a moment where Danny has a long hard look at himself and tries not to get in his own head. We get a little glimpse of Ferrari in there as well. Of course, we're at the Monaco Grand Prix as well. So Charles Leclerc, his hometown, his home area, his home nation, if you will, showing Carlos Sainz the streets of Monaco. And, you know, you kind of see, you know, Carlos Sainz is growing into his own. What I found strange is that, you know, Charles Leclerc gets P1 in qualifying, and yet we don't really get enough juice from that. And then Carlos Sainz, of course, P2 in the Monaco Grand Prix, finishes ahead of Lando Norris. But, you know, Ferrari kind of got the upper gear a little bit there. The narrative as well, though, at the beginning is that the McLaren is fast. The McLaren is good, Lando Norris is bloody good, and Danny Ricciardo, who's the more experienced, who you would think would be the quicker, is the one that's struggling. In the race, it kind of ends with heartbreak for Charles Leclerc, where in the formation lap, he had a gearbox failure, so he couldn't even start the race on pole in his home nation of the Monaco Grand Prix. And Carlos Sainz finishing in P2 behind Max Verstappen. I mean, it was an incredible race nonetheless. And it's a nice little bit towards the end where you got Carlos Sainz bumps into Lando Norris whilst Norris is doing his interview, his podium interview, if you will, for third place. And Carlos Sainz kind of can't get away from him. And a little bit of bromance there of what they once had at McLaren. It was very, very interesting to see the dialogue between you know, Charles, Carlos, Lando, and a bit of Danny Ricciardo in there as well. So Danny Ricciardo, you know, he's got a lot to think about. He's got a lot to play with here. McLaren are in their own boat of their own, whereby, you know, they were kind of looking bad financially as well a little bit at the start of the year. A lot of redundancies were made as the news broke out there, and so there's quite a few battles going on. And of course, who finishes third in the constructors is what it's all about. So it'll be interesting to see as the season goes on, before we come back to this story between Ferrari and McLaren.